Africa and the world, thank you for joining us on a fresh edition of Talking Point over your Pan-African channel, where today we focus in Sudan, when the latest reports, the Assistant Commander-in-Chief of the Sudanese Armed Forces, Yassi Oleta, declared on Tuesday earlier this week that the armed forces will not negotiate with the Rapid Support Forces RSF, even if the conflict continues for 100 years, undermining all efforts, including the just-ended AU preparatory meeting for inter-Sudanese dialogue. Though the AU preparatory meeting excluded other key stakeholders like Tagadoum and the United Congress, the declaration comes amidst UN-sponsored indirect talks that took place in Geneva, Switzerland, between the Sudanese government and the Rapid Support Forces, focusing on the deteriorating humanitarian situation. Numerous conflicts in the region have escalated over time, citing the case of Libya. Amid all failed attempts to quest or quell the power struggle in Sudan, what impact would this conflict have on regional stability? That is our focus for today in the course of today's edition of the program. Ladies and gentlemen, if you're just joining us, stay with us. Good afternoon, fervent televiewers and listeners of your Pan-African channel, For You Media Africa. Thank you for honoring today's invitation. With the be this time around in Sudan, where of course we shall be evoking the political crisis that has been plaguing the Northeast African country since April 15, 2023. And of course, in a recent outing on Tuesday, the Assistant Commander-in-Chief of the Sudanese Armed Forces said that the SAF would not be negotiating with the Rapid Support Forces. In the wake of these latest developments, we asked the question what impact this conflict would have on regional stability. And to evoke this topic of discussion this day, we're being joined by HALA ALKARIB, who is the Sudanese pro-democracy and Africa's feminist activist, and you double as a women rights network for the Eastern Horn of the African region. Thank you immensely, ma'am, for honoring our invitation.
Thank you for having me.
It's always a pleasure. Now, we equally acknowledge the presence of contribution of Godfrey MADANHIRE, who is a Pan-Africanist and social commentator, who shall be contributing to today's edition of the program all the way from South Africa. Meanwhile, we will not be wasting any much of your time to quickly start with today's conversation around this topic of discussion that focuses on Sudan with the ongoing political crisis in that part of the African continent. I'll debate with you, Hala. Now, being a pro-democracy activist and an African feminist, now what is your analysis of the ongoing conflict that is plaguing the African nation?
Well, you know, it's very unfortunate that the information about the brutality of the atrocities and the impact of the war on Sudan and Sudanese people is not being highlighted as it should be, particularly within the African continent. This is by far, in my view, one of the worst human rights and humanitarian crises that an African nation has been encountering, I would say, you know, after the war in Rwanda. The scale of violence, the scale of atrocities is unprecedented. Right now, Sudan has 11 million displaced persons, and we have literally around 6 million people who fled the country trying to find a safer place for them to neighboring countries. So it has an extremely significant ramifications and impact on the continent. This is in one hand. On the other hand, you know, the nature of the war itself, you know, it's extremely dangerous, and it's worse. You know, many of our Africans, brothers and sisters who are in leadership position to watch closely and pay close attention. The recruitments to fuel this war. It didn't happen in Sudan alone. It happened across the Sahel and the Horn region, but particularly from across the Sahel region, which is also, extremely highly problematic issue. This war has been fueled and capitalized on aspects of insecurity, poverty, of pastoral communities from across the Sahel region. And we anticipate that if it went on, there will be different manifestations and different groups, that could actually be part of it. And, in my view, the Sudan war is like a wildfire. It's not going to stay within the boundaries of Sudan. At the beginning, so many people kind of tended to minimize, this war as a conflict between two generals. But the truth about it, this is the proxy war, and this is a reflection of a new era, where we are exposed to new patterns of, colonialism and, extortion of resources, and there is various regional actors, who are engaged in fueling this war. Over to you.
ALKARIB, and now given you have cited a lot of powerful points, like you cited, the conflict ongoing in Sudan is not just a conflict that concerns just the country. It is something that, if not properly or carefully managed, could escalate to other countries in the sub-region. Now, let's get the point of view of you, Godfrey MADANHIRE, given your Pan-Africanist. You've listened to your co-panelists. In your opinion, Godfrey, what is your analysis of this ongoing conflict that is equally plaguing the African nation of Sudan?
Thank you for inviting me to your show, Turning Point. The ongoing conflict in Sudan is as unfortunate as all the other conflicts on the African continent. You talk about Burkina Faso, Cameroon, the Central African Republic, the DRC, Ethiopia, Mali, Mozambique, Nigeria, Senegal, Somalia, and many others. These conflicts are a cause for concern and a devastating humanitarian crisis due to political and sometimes ethnic tensions, especially when it comes to countries like Nigeria, Cameroon, and Ethiopia. The war in Sudan broke out on the 15th of April, that's last year in 2023. Among other things, it was caused by a power struggle between the army chief Abdel Fattah al-Burhan and the Rapid Support Forces commander Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo. Let us remember that President Omar al-Bashir was toppled in 2019, and the country was slowly moving towards civilian rule, but all those plans were disrupted when al-Burhan and Hamed staged a coup in 2021. So this is the background of what brought us to where we are now in 2024 in as far as Sudan is concerned.
Thank you immensely, Godfrey MADANHIRE. Now to proceed, we saw Ms. HALA, the Sudanese armed forces, like we mentioned in our preamble, Lieutenant General Yassi Olita, who mentioned that the SAF was not going to negotiate on any account, even if the conflict had to, say, continue for a duration of a century with the Rapid Support Forces. Now, if the fighting continues, we have reiterated or highlighted in the course of this program that it is going to escalate to other countries in the sub-region. But how does such actions or such remarks impede all the efforts that have been put so far to put a stop to the ongoing conflict?
I think so far the efforts that were invested on
Please,
Sudan
can you unmute your mic? Yeah, thank you.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yeah, all right. So I think so far the efforts that has been invested on, establishing a level of cessation of hostilities and engaging in any efforts, on civilian protections in Sudan has been extremely minimal and poor. And it does not match the scale of the crisis. And this is one of the problems that, both belligerents, they feel quite empowered and emboldened because they are not exposed to any serious pressure, either continentally, from African countries' governments or from the African Union or internationally. And so we hear this type of statements, because none of the bilateral institutions so far has established any accountability structure for both belligerents that they should be held accountable against. And that's in itself is a problem. The other challenge about Sudan crisis, it's, as I explained earlier, there is too many actors involved in this conflict. There is so many conflicting interests, but primarily, the engagements of the United Arab Emirates, in particularly in this war, and their open support of the rapid support forces and the amount of resources allocated, into sustaining this war is really highly problematic. And in my view, I don't think any both belligerents, if there isn't that, significant support that's coming, from the UAE, this war would have continued, or it would have exacerbated the way it is at the moment. So I think, there is definitely a need, a very strong need, that the African Union and bilateral institutions, they need to step up and they need to boost their efforts into coordinating efforts and addressing, the main actors who are directly engaged in fueling this conflict. The suffering of Sudanese people across the country is beyond imagination.
Absolutely. Now, staying with you, Ms. Hala, now we saw the just ended African Union preparatory meeting that took place in the capital of Ethiopia, Addis Ababa, and a bid to try to resolve the ongoing conflict in Sudan. Now, given we've seen countries, you're joining us from Kampala, we've seen nations equally like Uganda that have tried to bring a stop to the ongoing conflict in a bid to merge the two warring parties. But this summit preparatory meeting in Addis Ababa was void of the two, actors like Tagadum, that is a civil society group that has been trying to bring an end to the ongoing conflict, trying to quell the ongoing tensions. Now, could we say that the fact that these key actors like Tagadum and the United Congress, like we mentioned in our preamble, were absent from that preparatory meeting is already a lapse in the measures being put in place by the African Union?
Oh, absolutely. I think the African Union should have been more strategic, in terms of, and I think the African Union is also aware of the fact that, for any engagements, any discussion, any negotiations, that could attain a level of progress, you need to make sure that vital actors are present. And we cannot rush into conclusions or assume that things can happen, at one step. I think there is a need for more pressure, on all actors who are involved in this. This is beyond a question of who's going to rule Sudan post this conflict. This is, I think, the major questions is to stop this bloodbath and to stop this violence and to stop, the sexual violence and the random killing of civilians and the looting and all the madness that's currently happening in Sudan, particularly orchestrated by the rapid support forces. And, once that is brought prioritized, and a significant pressure was put on both belligerents, then people can actually move into a political process. I think the African Union would want to start with the political process, hoping to attain some form of cessations of hostilities, but a political process requires, strategic engagements, and it can't happen, at once. So I think that was one of the reasons why, at this point, the AU was not successful in bringing influential actors who are actually one way or the other affiliated with both warring parties.
Exactly, like you mentioned, it's a political process, and of course needs a strategic move in a bid to put an end to the tensions. I'll be coming back to you in a bit to capitalize on that aspect, but let's get the point of view of you, Godfrey MADANHIRE, given you heard your co-panelists, and of course citing that this is a political crisis that needs a very keen move if a peace needs to be brought back to the country. Now, in your opinion, how would these possible, or say, measures put so far impede, or better still undermine, all the efforts that have been put in place so far, Godfrey MADANHIRE?
Oh yes, you talk about Lieutenant General Yasser Al-Attah. He's not just the Assistant Commander-in-Chief of the Sudanese Armed Forces. When I look at him, he's a very influential and powerful figure. Let us remember that even his own father, Major Hashim Al-Attah, was executed for his role in the coup stage in 1971. So one can say this maybe runs in his blood, it runs in his family. Yasser Al-Attah is so focused on getting rid of the RSF in Khartoum, the capital of Sudan. At some point he mentioned that they will make sure that there is nothing that is to do with RSF in Khartoum. He's also known for attacking the Wagner Group and their role in the conflict. For the benefit of your listeners, maybe let me mention that the Wagner Group is a Russian state-funded private military company, which is believed to operate as a mercenary organization conducting operations around the world on behalf of the Russian government. So, according to Lieutenant General Yasser Al-Attah, the Wagner Group is involved in the extraction of gold and other minerals in Sudan. But now, this is not the only party that has been blamed by Lieutenant General Yasser Al-Attah. President William Ruto, who is currently battling the youth running riot in the streets of Kenya, has also been accused of supporting the RSF. He went on to challenge him to square up with the Sudanese army. Obviously, we know many leaders didn't approve this message coming from Yasser Al-Attah. They were very critical. We also know that the United Arab Emirates were also accused for providing ammunition to the RSF through Uganda, Central African Republic, and Chad. All these are claims from the Lieutenant General. He is even threatening to take them to the United Nations Security Council. So his remarks that they are not prepared to negotiate with the RSF should not be taken lightly. But they make us all feel that there's still a long way before peace and stability is restored in that part of the continent, unfortunately.
And of course, that aligns with your co-panelists that there is still a long way for peace to return. But to stay with you, Godfrey, in your opinion as an expert, why is this political crisis still persistent in Sudan despite all efforts?
The conflict in Sudan is still persistent and is likely to go on for quite a long time to come, mainly because of its complex nature. Let us be honest, we're not dealing with a simple conflict here. Like I mentioned earlier, it appears there are several parties involved in this conflict. Most of them, of course, they are contributing, influencing, or fighting behind the scenes. But that has always been the case when it comes to most conflicts on the African continent. The Democratic Republic of Congo is one example that quickly comes to mind. We know most countries needed something, or they had an interest in DRC. And for that reason, that war has been going on for years and years. I think economic factors play a significant role in this conflict we're talking about now in Sudan. Let us remember that when South Sudan gained independence in 2011, they went away with most of the region's oil fields, and that put a strain on the resources of Sudan. It is not a surprise that existing military groups in Sudan now fight over the little that remains. So, for as long as we are dealing with limited resources, in my opinion, the conflict is likely to continue. We had the framework agreement backed by various international bodies and signed in December 2022 with the hope of integrating the RSF into the army. But this did not do much to help, since both parties are not prepared to give up on power. Power is always an issue when it comes to countries that are on the African continent. The idea of integrating military forces is not a new phenomenon in Africa. Yes, it can be a solution. It has worked before. We know in South Africa, when in 1994, with the new dispensation, we saw the integration of Mkondo Wesizwe and Azania People's Liberation Army. We also saw the same thing happening in Zimbabwe in 1980, where the Rhodesian security forces came together with ZANLA and ZIPRA to form one united front. The same can be said about countries such as Namibia. So we probably shouldn't give up on the potential of the framework agreement of December 2022 being a solution to this Sudanese crisis. But we can only remain hopeful.
Thank you immensely, Godfrey MADANHIRE. Just to cite that you evoke certain key points like limited natural resources in Sudan that could be at the center of this continuous power grab in the country. Now, back with you, Ms. HALA. Now you listen to your co-panelists. You share the same point of view as Mr. MADANHIRE as far as what could be dragging the conflict or what is persisting the ongoing conflict in Sudan is concerned.
Well, Sudan natural resources are so many, and actually it's one of the main reasons, of this conflict. Sudan has an extremely, very, fertile agricultural land and water sources, in addition. Recently, following the independence of South Sudan, the issue of different minerals, but particularly gold, has become quite significant. And both warring parties, whether Sudan Armed Forces or the Rapid Support Forces, has been extensively involved, in gold mining and in completely manipulating or controlling the sector of mining, which is also one of the triggering factors of this war. I agree with with your guest on the fact that the roots of this war in Sudan actually goes back to the years and years and pockets of conflicts that has been happening across the country, yet it has not been fundamentally addressed or challenged by subsequent governments. And I would say including the transitional government, which is one of the most critical mistakes happened during the transition, is that the transition has allowed that the African Union mission, UN African Union mission, UNIMID, that was mandated to observe, and exercise a level of protections of civilians in the, over 20 years troubled region of Darfur. It was allowed for the mandate of that mission to end, to be replaced by a very small, limited mission that its mandate was mostly focusing on extending support to the executive branch of the government and to the transition. In my view, that has, to a large extent, enabled the level of militarizations and recruitment to extend, in Darfur and in other parts of the country, despite the fact that the mission was assigned to primarily observe Darfur, but at least the presence of such mission would have had an impact, in informing the African Union, informing, international actors about the growing militarism and recruitment that has led into the current war. But I honestly think that, Sudan's cessation of hostilities at this point in time and enabling Sudanese in their diversity to have a voice in their country's, situations and destiny is really critical, because when you go back, that has been the root cause of the problems that Sudanese in many parts of the country, they felt marginalized, they felt alienated, and they were subjected to layers of atrocities. And what's happening today in Khartoum, what's happening in Central Sudan, it happened over 20 years in Darfur, where rural Darfur has completely been destroyed and was subjected to land grabbing under Bashir's and his regime and allies, who were the RSF at the time, authority. And they continue to take control and exercise ethnic cleansing and, and genocide of indigenous African tribes, in Darfur and in, South Kordofan. And this is how it started, and this is how communities, they felt vulnerable and volatile, and they were stripped of their capacity, to resist and to engage constructively with their state, because the state contracted a militia to suppress them. So I think, the right way to approach this problem is not to undermine the voices of Sudanese if we really want to end this war, and to ensure that, a serious representations of Sudanese, in their diversity are part of any resolutions that is going to happen. And I think to a large extent, the African Union is understanding that the issue is, and the challenge is the strategy of how to put that together, how to bring people together and what kinds of tools or strategies, that it can be used to reach a formula that will allow everyone to have a voice, and accept the terms of democratic engagements, and that's a big issue. But at the moment, I think the priority, of bilateral, of regional institution, of international institution, as I said, is to stop this bloodbath and give the country a level of stability that will enable, a successful political engagements.
Exactly. We would like to borrow what happened in Ethiopia. After a long time of fighting, the country was finally able to enjoy what they call peace. Now, earlier on, Ms. Hala, you mentioned that the conflict in Sudan do have the participation of other external actors that could be there because of their interests or respective interests of what they're gaining in the country. Now, in the bid to capitalize on that aspect, could this, the presence of these external actors be the reason why up till now the issue or the problem in Sudan is yet to be resolved?
To a large extent, definitely, I would say that Sudanese political and civilian and military elites, both warring parties, are great part of the problem, absolutely. But I think, regional actors, they are playing significant role, and neighboring countries who has interest in Sudan are playing significant role in fueling this conflict by supporting one party to expand by, the availability of money and resources. And in that aspect, I would say particularly the United Arab Emirates. And just to say that those are not claims. There is a report by the UN mission that has been published a while ago that clearly spoke about that. There is a number of reports by human rights organizations, and there is evidence on the ground that clearly indicates the engagements of the UAE in the support of the RSF and in the support of factions of the civilian groups. And within the political setup of the region, that's understandable, the engagements and the interest. But the issue when it comes to Sudan, the ramification and the impact of that engagement is beyond devastations. It's the destructions of the whole country, and it's also the danger of the expansion of this conflict into other parts of the region.
Thank you immensely, Ms. ALKARIB, for your brilliant and insightful contribution on this edition of Talking Point over the Pan-African channel for you, Media Africa. Just to reiterate, ladies and gentlemen, you're watching us on 4U Television and, of course, listening to us over the airways of FM 96.3 Pan-African Radio. And, of course, we're streaming live on YouTube. Just to proceed, now to get the opinion of you, MADANHIRE. Now, you listen to your co-panelists and her point of view. Now, citing the case of Libya, a country that since it went through turmoil over 10 years ago, is yet to recover from what is happening. As we can see nowadays, the country is still having two different governments in that part of the African continent. But in a bit to borrow from what is happening in Libya, what impact will the unending war in Sudan have on regional stability?
The crisis in Libya has left over 300,000 people homeless, especially those that are living in Tripoli, the capital. Drones have been used to kill over 300 innocent people since 2019. This conflict has led to the looting, obviously, of resources such as oil, and it is always the case. Let us not forget that this conflict started in 2011 with the uprising that led to the demise of Muammar Gaddafi. It is his removal from office that created a vacuum in the security space, which eventually led to the mushrooming of militia groups, creating chaos throughout the country. So, if we look at how it started in Libya and how it's going on in Sudan, there is a relationship. Because obviously in Sudan as well, it started off with the removal of al-Bashir, and then it moved on to a promised civilian rule, which didn't happen because militant groups then took over. And here we are. People are dying, people are being displaced. So if countries like Sudan are to learn vital lessons from Libya, it is the realization that conflicts involving the military can only lead to destruction. So far, not under 20,000 people have lost their lives in Sudan, and millions have been displaced. It is unfortunate that not enough media coverage is given to this crisis, especially if we compare it to the coverage given to Russia and Ukraine, or even the Gaza conflict. We should therefore applaud programs such as Talking Point for helping our people gain insights into what is happening in Sudan.
Ms. ALKARIB, you listen to Mr. Godfrey. Now, listening to him, he cited the fact that there's not enough media coverage on what's happening in Sudan. Now, we've seen over the years, or since the conflict erupted, we've seen internet cuts or power cuts there in Sudan. And that has hindered the coverage of what's happening in that part of Africa. Now, with relation or to, I liken that to other conflicts that are happening on the African continent, do you share the same point of view as your co-panelists, and do you think what is needed to be done for, say, undercover conflicts on the African continent to be addressed so that we can definitely lead to lasting peace?
Well, I definitely agree. I think there is exceptionally coldness when it comes to, to atrocities and violence that's happening in Africa. There is an assumption all the time that we are going to killing each other, and so it's okay to ignore it for a while or for a long time, like what's happening in the DRC. And what has been happening in Darfur for over 20 years. So there is definitely an issue of, there is an intentional neglect of the crisis in Sudan. There is an intentional neglect in terms of extending protections and humanitarian aid to the Sudanese people in these difficult times. And there is lack of interest as well in terms of investing in on cessation of hostilities, in a serious process of cessation of hostilities, on putting enormous pressure in terms of accountability on both belligerents, and very serious accountability that would actually force the different actors to come to terms with ceasing, this brutal violence, where both of them are using civilian bodies as human shields and as a strategy of war. In terms of the media, yes, there is, lack of interest, clearly, with the exceptions of very few media outlets. But Sudan is nowhere to be found on many of the mainstream media, despite this dangerous situation. And as it was said, Sudan is surrounded by volatile countries. The militarization and recruitment is happening from across the borders of Sudan. So there is a big mess that is currently happening, and it's extremely dangerous to the security of other countries around it, which is really requires, attentions from media outlets, and from international regional mechanisms as well. But that is not happening at all.
Exactly. There's been this call over time for Africans to be able to tell the African story from an African perspective or an African point of view. Now, in your opinion, how would that be done if when we have Africans that are being touched by the conflict or what's happening, but they are not able to say, tell the rest of the world what is happening, but we get foreign media instead reporting these stories from their own perspectives? How does that hinder the recreation process?
Well, as I said, this war is happening, as a result of and has impact of militarization and recruitment across at least 4 or 5 African countries. And until now, it's very difficult for African media to investigate. And I think it's really important for Pan-African media like yourself, taking into consideration the complexity, of course, and the difficulties in terms of accessing resources and support. But I think it's crucial to start seriously investigating, the acts of recruitment that's happening across the continent, as in relation to Sudan war. That has happened before. Now it's happening, extensively, considering, the RSF themselves, are transborder, transnational, across-border and transnational militia, and they were able to do that, and that recruitment is not new, by the way. It happened before. Recruitments of poor African, insecure, marginalized African youth. It happened before during the war in Yemen. There have been a massive recruitment campaigns that nobody talked about it. It happened. It started all with the conflict in Darfur. And the implications of Bashir's war against Darfuri people when they started to demand, justice and their rights on their lands and so on. So we definitely need a very, very, committed investigative media that looks at the impact of this war and its also, consequences on our societies, because it is happening, and it's happening right in front of our eyes.
Exactly. I'll be coming back to you for us to understand the impact it has had on a vulnerable population. But then I would like to get the opinion of Mr. Godfrey MADANHIRE. Now, given the crisis in Sudan, we should reiterate this has led to a humanitarian crisis. Now, it has hindered equally the progress of the African nation. And given that African stakeholders do want this conflict in the African nation to come to an end, how can the different stakeholders go about bringing an end to this crisis? And of course, we have cited that, of course, if it's ongoing, it's because of the persistent limited natural resources in the African nation. Now, in your opinion, MADANHIRE, how can the different stakeholders ensure that the crisis in Sudan can come to an end?
Ending the war is what we all want, obviously. But it can only be possible if the Sudanese Armed Forces, SAF, and the Rapid Support Forces, RSF, agree to sit down and talk. They need to move away from this obsession of the need to hold on to power and think about the Sudanese people. I also think that diplomatic efforts are necessary if you want to see this crisis behind us. It will, however, be better, in my opinion, if these efforts are not led by Western forces. Because our people always have a belief that for as long as the Western forces are involved, they do have ulterior motives. The African Union is the Peace and Security Council led by Ambassador Bankole Adeoye as the commissioner. He is well experienced. He is a diplomat who has been in the game for over 30 years. I'm sure he can play a significant role to put out the fires in Sudan. That is just my opinion. So I've heard a lot of people complain that our African Union does not have enough teeth to bite. Maybe it is because of a lack of action, or significant action for that matter, when it comes to issues like this. We have people dying, we have people being displaced in Sudan and many other African countries. We want to see the African Union playing an active role to try and put an end to these massacres.
Exactly, thousands of or millions of persons have been displaced as a result of the conflict in Sudan, some that have relocated to neighboring countries like Chad and a host of others. Now, back to you, Ms. ALKARIB. You listened to your co-panelists, and just to reiterate that since the conflict in Sudan debuted in April last year, we've seen nearly 16,000 people that have been killed as a result of the ongoing conflict, not to mention those that have been displaced. Now, as a pro-democracy or Sudanese pro-democracy and African feminist advocate, or better still activist, you are someone that works with the Women Network in the African continent. What impact has this conflict had on the vulnerable population, that is most especially women and children?
So just a comment, there is only 15,000 people that were killed in West Darfur last June after, an act of genocide that was committed against the Masalit in West Darfur by the RSF and affiliated militia.
Okay.
Number of people who were killed across Sudan, by now it exceeds 55,000. The RSF keeps attacking farming communities, villages, and towns, and people are not protected. They are quite exposed. General Atta speaks about war continuing for 100 years, yet, we are caught in between a very brutal militia of mercenaries,
Exactly.
unstructured completely, and they are there to loot, and to kill and commit sexual violence, and extremely indifferent, uncorrupt military institution that protection of civilians is not part of their agenda. So it's quite, very, very, painful situations that Sudanese are found themselves in. When it comes to women and girls, I think women are bearing, the heaviest load of these atrocities. According to the UN Population Fund, UNFPA, there is 7 million Sudanese women who are exposed or might be exposed to sexual violence. We documented hundreds of cases of gang rape since the beginning of the conflict. From day one, April 15, the RSF started to enter people's home and rape women inside their home, in front of their parents, in front of their siblings. And that we knew, as activists, we knew that, we knew exactly what the RSF is capable of doing, and we have been speaking about that as feminists and as women's rights advocates, because we did work on the crisis in Darfur for over 20 years. We understood how sexual violence can be used. In Darfur, it was also used in the Congo as a strategy, for extortion, as a strategy for dispossession, as a strategy to terrorize communities. And this is what has been happening in Sudan as we are speaking. Massive number of sexual violence, sexual slavery. Women are enslaved in different ways. They were forced to provide services. They were profiled and criminalized and accused of collaboration with the militia. They were held hostages, and impoverished. And then at the same time, overburdened with making critical decisions about their families and communities, as you know. So it's horrific for women. It's quite painful. And we are very grateful for the solidarity and support that we are receiving from our sisters within the continent. They are always there, signing solidarity letters, joining our efforts, to address regional and international actors about what's happening to the women and girls. But unfortunately, then, as you are aware, the narrative, about these, brutal crimes that's happening to women is not part of the political process, and it's not reflected, which is in itself is very, very problematic. And in Sudan, we have done that often for years. Sudan has over, 50, 60 peace agreements. None of them has ever addressed issues of transitional justice. None of them has incorporated any issues regarding truth and reconciliations. That never happened. Sudan has never undergone any process of disarmament or demobilizations. So the accumulations of militarization and militarism has been happening for very, very long time. And it manifests also in, a long history of violence against women starts from Bashir eras and before, but also lack of commitment of,
Exactly.
And very deeply ingrained culture of discrimination against women within Sudan political elites. And now as women, we are really paying a hefty price. So overall, I would say Sudanese women needs to be listened to. I think, we have to be listened to by our African brothers and sisters at the African Union. Very critical, to adopt and listen to our narrative and to our point of view in terms of how this conflict should be addressed. Our views should not be alienated. We are
Absolutely.
pushing, but we are yet, to see if we are going to be taken seriously or will be dealt with as collateral damage as usual.
Exactly, and that is the sad reality. Women and girls as well, even children, are sometimes part of the vulnerable population that sometimes get to face the repercussions of these conflicts that are happening across the African continent. But to stay with you, now you are a member or you work with the Women's Rights Network. Now, given that is equally a group that is trying to facilitate the recovery process, what measures are being put in place to ensure that this vulnerable population, especially women, girls, are able to facilitate, or what measures have been put in place, rather, to facilitate the recovery process from these conflicts that are plaguing African nations?
It's still, we are at a very early stages. The efforts invested so far in supporting women and amplifying their voices is extremely minimal. And, it's not, there is no significant investment on that in terms of making sure that the voices of affected women, of women survivors of violence, of women, who are at the front line leading the humanitarian actions and trying to sustain their families and communities, for their voices to be heard, for their point of views to be incorporated. We are really still far from that, and we are still struggling to be heard. There have been a conference that was held in Kampala by the African Union for women from different groups. In my view, it was similar to the attempt that happened in Addis Ababa. There haven't been sufficient strategic thinking in terms of how to approach women in their diversity and how to make sure that when they brought together, they were brought around an agenda that's mattered to them. So I think we are still struggling. I think it's very important for the African Union, to have a conversation, to listen to those of us who has been on the ground for a very long time, Paris, and everything is possible and can be done, but we really have to be sharp when, we are approaching it, and have functioning strategy and understanding the power dynamic. And that's a problem, as you said, as African actors and activists and civil society has been on the ground for years. We are not considered advisors or experts. And so the outcome usually is, expertise is being sought from somewhere else, and the result is, and I don't know why we're not learning, the result is usually a process that's not successful.
Exactly. Thank you immensely, Hala. ALKARIB, now to get, there's a unity strength, not just in Africa, but beyond the African continent. Now, reciting back the case of Ethiopia, where we said peace prevailed after there was collaborated efforts. Now, getting the point of view, GODFREY MADANHIRE, now, how can regional collaboration participate or contribute to putting an end to the conflict in Sudan?
Indeed, collaboration is key. Africa is a history of regional leaders coming together to deal with issues affecting their neighbors. So it won't be for the first time that we've seen our leaders coming together, finding solutions to problems affecting their neighbors. One just hopes that countries in East Africa begin to actually participate actively in these issues. Burundi has a role to play. The Comoros need to come on board. Djibouti, they need to say something. Ethiopia, yes, we know. There are fires in Tigray, but you need to be involved in Sudan. Eritrea, Kenya, yes, we know the young people are in the streets, but they need to play a role in Sudan. Rwanda, we know they were dealing with elections, but they need to come on board. Seychelles, Somalia, South Sudan, Tanzania, Uganda cannot afford to look the other way when fires are burning in Sudan. We know they are dealing with their own issues. But what happens in Sudan has serious implications for East Africa as a bloc. We also know that countries such as Kenya are home to thousands of refugees right now who have fled the war in Sudan. This obviously has economic repercussions to the host country, especially when you consider that Kenyans themselves are not happy with their own government right now. They are in the streets. Let me conclude by reminding your listeners that the African Union had a project calling for the silencing of the guns by 2020. We are now in 2024, and yet there is a conflict in Cabo Delgado in Mozambique. Tigray war continues in Ethiopia since 2019. The M23 is causing havoc in DRC, where South Africa recently lost their troops while on duty, and the list goes on. Africa needs to put an end to these wars so that we can focus on building a prosperous continent, the Africa we want, as envisaged by Agenda 2063. Thank you very much for inviting me to your show, Talking Point. I am Godfrey, Mr. G. Madanhire.
To you, Godfrey MADANHIRE, who joined us all the way from South Africa. Now, to proceed back with you, HALA ALKARIB. Now you listen to him. He says that collaborative effort is necessary to taming the conflict in Sudan. Now, we cited earlier on that a preparatory meeting organized by the African Union was void of some key stakeholders, which we mentioned, and we went ahead to analyze that part. But then we've seen the African Union trying to put a stop to conflicts, not just what's happening in Sudan, but other conflicts on the African continent. We've equally seen the United Nations Security Council that has made a statement with regards to the conflict in Sudan, as we saw the representative of the United States, that is Tom Perrillo, who is in Sudan, trying to garner efforts or garner support in the bid to put that conflict to an end. Now, in your perspective as an expert as well, how or what role is the African Union and the United Nations Security Council supposed to play as far as stopping conflicts in Africa is concerned?
It's, as I said, this is the wildfire. It's not only Eastern Africa, it's the Sahel. And Sudan has a very geopolitically is really positioned in between the Eastern Africa and the Sahel region. And the volatility of countries like Chad, like Niger, like Mali, all the way that built, all the way to Nigeria, it's something that we're seeing. We're seeing in the recruitment, we're seeing in the militarized engagements. And then we are also seeing the impact of this conflict on Eastern Africa. And the fact that, many of the countries also are struggling with their own internal issues. South Sudan, in particularly, the current situation, Ethiopia, and so on. So it's really important to contain and to address what's happening in Sudan. It should be a priority, at this point in time, and for it to be addressed, if it continued to be dealt with in this as a minor issue, if there is no significant pressure, on both belligerents, and there is no significant pressure on the actors that are contributing to this war, unfortunately, the war will expand. So it's very, very important, to understand that what's happening in Sudan is very dangerous, really dangerous. Yeah.
It's a Sudan problem, but a regional problem. Now, given we saw the proliferation of the conflict or say terrorist attacks we've seen in the Sahelan region was as a result of the overthrow of Muammar Gaddafi in Libya in 2011. Now, looking a bit to round this up, we've seen the problem that's happening in the Sahelan region. Of course, the countries in West Africa trying to address that particular problem. But could we say that what's happening in the Sahel region indirectly could be impacting what's happening in Sudan, given we have weapons? We saw Lieutenant General Olita that spoke of a war continuing for 100 years. Yet we still have the AU's project of silencing the guns, which was supposed to end in 2020, but yet was extended to 2030.
Absolutely.
Now it was extended to 2030. But now with all these points, how can the African Union contribute to bringing in place measures like measures that could say end the spread of weapons across Africa, and in a bid to curb the crisis that is happening in the African country?
I think the leadership has to agree that, the main issue is the stability.
Absolutely.
And the main issue, is peace. And the main issue, and that cannot happen if our governments are in constant war with their own people. So that in itself is a critical issue. And it's important. And I think the African Union has taken serious steps to ensure that, but I think, there is a need for more compromises at the local level, to end the status of volatility that our nation states are struggling with. I think, if we attain stability, the opportunities of collaborations are massive, massive, and prosperity of development, of extending hands to each other, of supporting each other, lifting each other's, it can be very real. But how can we make that connection? That stability doesn't mean repression. Stability, it means peace, and it means accepting each other, and it means, peaceful transition of power. And that's one of the biggest problems. The issue of autonomy, and enabling our people to benefit from our own resources is also a critical issue. Leadership are not gatekeepers or brokers, into the country's resources. The country resources, land, and other resources belongs to the people of the country. And it doesn't mean that, killing opportunities of investment, but it means that priorities should go for, for the people in the country, should go for the people in the continent. And those are layers and layers of questions, that has to be addressed beyond rhetoric, and just speeches, has to be interpreted into real actions. And I think your guests have spoken about it's really important, for Africans to come together as Africans. The fact that right now there is, African people that is being subjected to genocide, and there is a large number of us has been profiled and targeted for their identity and who they are. It's a very serious issue that should not be concealed. and we have to address it. The fact that we have, construct a militia that's using ethnicity, and to fight its war, it's a very dangerous situation, and it's not coming from one country. This is a group that is spread across different countries, and there is resources that was made available, and so those issues has to be taken seriously. Considering the volatility and the vulnerability of and the fact that our nation states are still growing and young. Yeah. So what happened, to each one of us, it actually happened to all of us.
It's said on the African continent that a divided kingdom cannot stand. But then, before seeking peace, I would like to capitalize back on the statement made by the Assistant Commander-in-Chief. If he's saying extending this conflict for a duration of a century means there should be some sort of backing coming from somewhere. But then, in a bit, why can we not ask ourselves the question, where is the weapons coming from? Because if we keep having this conflict on the African continent, it's because we still have these weapons that continue to be given to these people, or say those without arms, for them to head to the streets, or better still, to create chaos. Where is the weapons that are being used to incite this violence on the African continent coming from?
I think it's coming from all over the world. I think we are an active market, for small arms and, for those type of weapons. I think it's available if you have, and I think, the level of corruptions and the investments on militarization and an economy, it led us to where we are. In Sudan, and I can speak about Sudan, the level of recruitments between 2013, until the war has erupted was extremely massive. The youth lack of access to education, and preferring to act as mercenary soldiers on behalf of wealthy nations, it has been a pattern. The participation in Sudan on the Yemen war, the participation of Sudan in Libya war, and this, and then of course the poor investment on education, the poor investments on development are all factors that frustrated, millions and millions of youth, and Sudan particularly. Almost close to 70% of us are below the age of 30. So imagine, that the core investment for the past, I would say, 15 years at least, was on militarization and recruitment. So this has led us to where we are.
Amidst all these tensions, we hope that a dialogue will be made, and of course peace is going to return to the African continent, and of course most especially the African nation of Sudan. In a bit to conclude, just to reiterate, we're discussing the ongoing political tensions in Sudan, where we saw the SAF said it was not going to negotiate with the rapid support forces, but we're hoping that amidst all these negotiations will happen, and of course dialogue will bring an end to the conflict. And a bit to wrap up today's conversation, Ms. HALA ALKARIB, now charting the way forward in your perspective as an expert, what should be done for Sudan or for peace to return to the African country?
I think, if we manage to reach a cessation of hostilities and a formula of civilian protections, then Sudan should move into a political process that would satisfy and respond to the aspiration of its people, for peace, for stability, and for democratic rule or a peaceful transition of power, and engagement of Sudanese people in their different, regions and localities. Sudan is still a big country, and so it's not a country that can be controlled by a clique of or a small group of people. And as I said, that was the main reason where we had we're living through this situation, is the failure to enable Sudanese to have a say in their country. But overall, fundamentally, majority of Sudanese are very committed, to their country, are very committed to stay as one nation. The challenge is, of course, we don't have a strong voice in that process. And we hope that a cessation of hostility will enable Sudanese to peacefully have a voice and engage in that process. I strongly believe that the African Union should and must have a role in challenging what's happening in Sudan, having the capacity to look at the problems in its complexity and all the layers, that intersect within this crisis. I think it's very, very important for the AU to assume their responsibilities. I think African leadership should really, examine and look at what's happening at Sudan as a very serious threat to, to the Eastern and the Sahel region. I hope that, women in their diversity will have a voice also in this process, in solidarity and collaboration with our other sisters, within the Sahel and Eastern Africa and the rest of the continent. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you immensely, HALA ALKARIB, for your brilliant and insightful, very powerful contributions to today's edition of Talking Point.
Thank you very much. I'm, very, very grateful for the opportunity.
Meanwhile, I would like to acknowledge equally the contribution of GODFREY MADANHIRE, who joined us all the way from South Africa. Just to mention that HALA ALKARIB is, she works with Women Rights Network and is Sudanese pro-democracy and African feminist expert. I've been your host, NJIX NABESEH. Today we're discussing Sudan. Maybe next time we'll focus on something else touching the African continent. Meanwhile, we'll say thank you for staying through with us all through today's edition of the program. And of course, programs continue over your Pan-African channel. Bye-bye for now.